So I'm going to start out just talking about the electronic collar and what its advantages and disadvantages are, right? So one of the things that's an advantage about the electronic collar over other tools, of course, is that we don't really have a distance component, right? So when we're dealing with dogs in traditional manners, we have leashes or whatever, our sphere of influence is much smaller, right? You outside of 20 or 30 feet, you're not affecting dogs traditionally anymore. Lines longer than 30 feet get very unwieldy. And also you can put the dog in more natural situations that you couldn't safely with a line on them, right? Dragging a line, the dogs are very aware that the line is on them or not. It catches on things, and there are certain types of environments and situations that are very challenging. So the e-collar has a distinct benefit that I can reach you at distance and the dog can move more naturally. We can put them in more realistic situations. The other thing that's an advantage over traditional tools is the ability to be consistent about the level of input, right? So assuming I have a good collar that's fit properly, then I can know exactly where I am on that collar, and I can use a consistent stimulation, and I can change that relatively quickly in a given situation. With a leash, that's not always the case. It takes a lot of practice. Sometimes I pop the dog harder, sometimes it's softer. How much slack is in the leash when it happens? Is the dog moving? All those mechanical things make consistent inputs harder with a leash, right, than you are with the e-collar. So those things have advantages there. The disadvantages are electricity is a novel stimuli. It doesn't feel like anything else the dogs have felt, right? So if I'm using a leash or I'm grabbing the dog with my hands or I'm pulling on those inputs are similar to physical inputs the dogs are used to. Dogs putting their mouths on each other. That's a part of a dog's life. So those physical manipulations feel relatively natural. Electrical stimulation doesn't. So I mentioned earlier, it's very good at creating superstitious associations, right? Because it's novel and it's not connected to you, you can do it from a distance, you can do it with no physical movement, that kind of thing. It can feel like it's coming from the environment for the dog. And so without proper preparation, I can make the dog associate that with something that's around them in the environment, and I can get avoidance to those things that I may or may not want as we go forward. There are spots in which people use an electronic collar deliberately to create superstitious associations. So if somebody's been doing, for instance, rattlesnake avoidance, like if you're the Southern Californians, right? And the people in the desert, the people that hike a lot, that is one thing that certain trainers choose to do. And so they don't necessarily have to prep the dog for a collar. They put the collar on the dog has no idea what this is. They have a rattlesnake that's been defanged or has its mouth taped shut or whatever, and they plunk it out there. And as the dog approaches, then the snake rattles, they blast the dog on a high level on the collar, and they make avoidance. And that dog now thinks that the snake did that to them. So the dog becomes avoidant to sight, sound, smell of snakes, right? So that would be a place, and we'll talk later about what I like and don't like about this, but that is a deliberate use of the collar to create a superstitious association. Somebody might do that as well with something like counter surfing, right? So your dog gets up on the counters and is eating the butter off the counters a bunch of times. And now the dog doesn't get up there when you're around, but as soon as you leave, they get on the counters, right? So somebody sets up the camera and they have the dog loose and the dog jumps up on the counter and they go zing, and the dog thinks the counter bit them, right? And so now the dog superstitiously associates that stimulation with a counter, and so they stay off the counter, right? An electric fence, like somebody would use it for, you have a dog that's trying to climb out of a fence. So they put the e-collar on. When the dog jumps and puts his feet up on the fence, they zing the dog with the collar, and the dog thinks the fence did it, and so it avoids the fence, right? So those are kind of classic superstitious associations. But in general, we're trying to avoid those. Most of the time when we're using the collar for obedience or things, I don't want my dog to associate it. If I'm using it for behavioral issues, if I want to control my dog who has issues with other dogs, around other dogs, I don't want my dog to think the other dog did that to them, because it can increase aggression or fear or other things, right? So most of the time, we're deliberately trying to avoid those. And e-collars, you have to work extra hard not to make that happen. The e-collar also has a function that can be an advantage in one situation and a disadvantage in another. And that is the impersonal nature of it, right? So the electronic collar, if I'm using a leash, it's inherently personal. It's connected to me. I have to make a movement to pull on it. The dog knows it's coming from me, right? And in those cases, and there's places in which I want them to know that. So if my dog's focused on something else and I pull on the leash, they don't think that other thing did that because they know I moved, I'm attached to it. So there's a personal nature about using traditional tools. And so sometimes that's an advantage. I want the dog to know that. Other times that's a disadvantage. You have dogs that now are not responsive unless you're in the picture, or there are dogs that start to worry about their handler because the correction they got or the aversive experience was more personal. And there's spots where I would like it to be nothing to do with me and to be about the behavior. And the e-collar does that well. And then there are other places where that can create problems, where the dog associates with the environment. So that impersonal nature of the collar has an advantage in certain circumstances and a disadvantage in others. And so we need to talk about that when we're planning on using the collar. Another disadvantage of the collar that I've already mentioned is that it's a piece of technology and it doesn't always work. So that's why, as we talk about getting collars, reliability and durability are really important, right? There's some collars out there that have nice features, but in my personal experience, they've been unreliable, so I don't use them, right? And even though somebody's been very innovative about the features they've put on that collar, and some of those are good ideas, I'm like, if the collar's not going to work, that doesn't have it. And so they can fail. They can not be charged. You can have contact issues, right? Another disadvantage of the collars is I have to be careful with certain dogs that have sensitivity to the contact points, right? So some dogs will get hot spots from the contact points. People will say that the electrical stimulation damages the dog's neck, but it does not, right? I've put every collar that I ever use, I put it on my own body. I turn it all the way up and I hold the button down until it times out. Unpleasant, but doesn't burn you, doesn't damage your skin. So a properly designed collar can't physically injure the dog that way, but those contact points pressing against the skin and moving can create hot spots. And if you leave them on too much, or the collar's too tight, or a dog just is sensitive, some dogs have sensitivity to the metal, and so you have to use different different contact point types. There's a variety of things like that. So the collar, you have to be careful a little bit where you wouldn't necessarily with another tool, that you move it around on the dog's neck, or don't leave it on for too long, or it's not too tight, or things like that as well. So the technology component of it can be problematic and can be very frustrating. If you're relying on the collar to work and it's not consistent or doesn't work, then that's a big problem for us, which you don't typically have. Not that a leash couldn't break or a collar couldn't come off. Those things can happen too. But generally speaking, those tools don't fail due to small, subtle things. Contact is a big issue. Lots of dogs, depending on coat type and things, can be very difficult to get consistent contact with the skin with the different, and they have a wide variety of probe types. You have Huskies and even German Shepherds. Lots of German Shepherds have very thick, dense undercoats, and it can be difficult to get good contact on the collars. But so inherent in all this is that the collar ultimately does not, is no different than any other tool in terms of how dogs take it and stuff. If it's introduced properly, the rules of learning and application are not different for the e-collar than they are for other things, but it will have some advantages and disadvantages as we go along.